Hello and welcome to Audiobook Reviews. In this video, I'll be discussing The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington, the first book in the Licanius, may or may not be mispronouncing that, but in the Licanius Trilogy. This was the first published work by James Islington. I feel like I've been reading a lot of series that were first lately, but I picked this one up. It looked pretty interesting. I do like the cover on this one. It's kind of minimal, but also definitely feels fantasy with a lot of the really minimalist covers these days. I quite like this. It's really interesting. But I picked this up in a bookstore and was taking a look at it. And all over it are quotes comparing it to Wheel of Time, or saying if you like Wheel of Time, you're really going to enjoy this. It's great for readers of Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. And so while I was a little hesitant, I figured that means I definitely had to try to read this book. I am a massive fan of the Wheel of Time. It is my favorite series of all time, and I absolutely love Brandon Sanderson's works as well. So if this is even anything like those, I figured I really had to give this a shot. So I picked it up and I decided to start it pretty quickly. So it already had upset my to read list a little bit because I was intrigued. And I do have to say right off the bat, this story is really, really coming from a place of inspiration of the Wheel of Time. Hard. This is something that can be a little worrisome. And at first, I was not sure how I felt about it because looking at the base premise down to literally two of the oceans have the same names as those in the Wheel of Time world. And a lot of the kind of basis for what's going on does seem really similar. Now, I did end up really enjoying this, and I'll get in a bit more to that here shortly. But just to kind of set the scene, I'm going to note right now there is a lot going on in even just the first book. I've read the first book and I have just started the second one, and there is just a vast story. There are a lot of characters, there are a lot of different plot lines, groups, organizations, etc. So I'm actually going to try and stay fairly spoiler free for the most part in this video. I will warn if I do talk about spoilers, but just because there is so much to discuss without even getting into the details. So I'm not going to necessarily hit on every point by any means, just because there is a lot, but I kind of wanted to preface with that. So getting into what this story is essentially about and where it takes place. The bulk of what we're looking at is in the country of Andara. And the kind of premise here is that previously, about 20 years ago, this area specifically was kind of controlled by a group of people called augurs who had special abilities and used one of the forms of magic in the world. Under them are who are called the gifted, who specifically have the gift and they can use essence. And essence is described as being kind of the life force of everything, and specifically people who are able to use that, use their own essence, and do different things, they are called the gifted. There was something that happened, and the augurs, one of their really important abilities is they can see into the future. They get visions of the future, and those visions stopped coming true. So there was kind of an uprising, and the people in the kind of token royalty who existed but didn't really have any power, they rose up and they end up defeating the augurs and eventually getting the remaining gifted to sign a treaty that vastly limits their power and what they're allowed to do, to the extent there are actually 4 tenets put into place, and they're put into place in a way that binds all gifted to follow them, including that they are not allowed to use their powers on non-gifted, that they do have to essentially listen and adhere to what's called the administration, who's the group of people who's in charge of kind of running the gifted and keeping them in check, and really limits what they're allowed to do. Also set into place that they are not allowed to leave certain areas without having a shackle on. A shackle being something that essentially stops them from using their powers at all. And if any gifted break these rules or are deemed to not be able to safely use their powers, another device is used that turns them into what's called a shadow, being somebody who has the power essentially taken away from them, and they're no longer able to use essence, and they're get these black lines all over their face and become a little bit disfigured as well, hence kind of the name shadow there. So that already is a lot of information, and it's given to you some at the beginning, but all throughout as well. And that's one thing I do really want to comment on is Islington manages to give you a ton of information without it ever feeling like an exposition dump. You learn quite a lot in the first book, and yet it's learned in kind of natural ways, and it's very creative the way that you learn some things before the characters do, and sometimes you're learning things from the characters. There's just so much going on, and this really is a book that will keep you guessing. The way the author writes, once again, some things you kind of already know about or suspect, and other things are just given to you throughout the narrative. Something else I already mentioned, this book does deal with people who can see the future. That is something that's really difficult to write with. When you have somebody able to see into the future, know what's going to happen, how do you still keep that interesting? How do you have tension if they know certain big events? And certain big events are foretold in the story. So that was something that was crafted really well. And the way that that is done, the people, what they see, how they see it, they don't necessarily know a lot about it. This is once again taking place 20 years after the former group of augurs were in control. And so a lot of the different powers and skills and so much knowledge is lost. There was a lot, it's mentioned, that was lost during the wars, lots of books and information destroyed, and a lot of the elder people, not specifically saying the elders, which the gifted kind of people who are on top are called the elders, but in general, a lot of the people who'd been around, many died. And so this, even though it's only been a generation, this is really starting from a place where not a lot is known by all of the characters. All throughout, we see different characters who either may not be who they seem to be, know different other things, and once again, it's woven together very well, so you really don't always know what's going on. And it's not, I don't even want to say that it's full of twists, so to speak, because to me, if you're looking at a really big twist, it's usually something that just comes out of nowhere and changes things drastically. The way the book is written is there are definitely some things that you can see coming and expect, but then it's just additional things crafted through the narrative, and the narrative slowly builds to a reveal more than an actual twist. It's something that you're not like, I can't believe that happened. You're like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. This is what he was doing. How didn't I see that? And it's really, really crafted well. It's something that can be hard to do in this kind of book as well. It can be difficult because there are so many plot lines, so many bigger pieces going on that it really does make it difficult. And I will say it wasn't a perfect book. It was a fantastic book, but there were some points, especially toward the ending, where there was just so much going on. You didn't really feel like you'd necessarily built up and had a huge payoff. The payoff was there, but there was so many different events going on that are going to be, of course, continued in the next two books, I'm sure. But a lot of that still, you didn't feel like you got as much resolution. In a way, the end of the first book felt almost like things were really just starting. And that's not to say that a lot didn't happen in the first book. So much did, but there are other pieces in here as well that really, really make it very expansive overall. And so I've been trying to be careful not to say too much. I will say one other thing I want to mention. I talked a lot about similarities with the Wheel of Time, and from the kind of synopsis I gave, you definitely see things that are very similar. Kind of the use of the essence, similar in a lot of ways to the One Power, the fact that there are these items that exist that can kind of basically stop the flow of it. Definitely made me think of the Adam from Wheel of Time. And the idea too, there's vessels that hold essence and do certain things, seem really similar to Angriel and other such items in the Wheel of Time as well. And there is, I think, a little bit too inspiration from the Brandon Sanderson side. In the author's note at the back, it actually said that the Mistborn series is what inspired him to actually finally start writing. So even though a lot of this does seem to be inspired by the Wheel of Time, there are a lot of elements of kind of the way Brandon Sanderson writes as well. Because despite the similarities to the Wheel of Time, the writing style is very, very different from Jordan. It's much more fast-paced and quick moving and really doing a lot more. And it's written a bit simpler, a bit more to the side of Brandon Sanderson, who's stated many times he likes to keep his prose very simple and easy to understand with it as well. So you definitely get a lot going on here and a lot of those similarities. And for me personally, and some people might disagree, I can definitely see how some people would think this is too similar, but it actually, for me, made me almost feel like this story could take place in a distant portal world in the Wheel of Time universe. Almost like this is something that could be happening there, with definitely some liberties being taken. But I actually had these thoughts so much, I'm going to be posting a video the Wednesday following this video going over my new headcanon for this series, which goes in a bit more in depth, and I won't detail any more of it there. But if you are interested in seeing my thoughts there and really talking a lot more about the similarities and how it might work, definitely watch out for that video. So now I do want to talk about a few other pieces, and I feel like this is the spot where it is going to be a little bit more spoilerish. I'm not going to talk still about really, really specific events. I'm going to keep it still a little bit vague, but some of the general topics I'm going to talk about, I feel like would spoil important parts. So from here, I will be getting into it a bit. If you do want to skip this section, check the description and I will post the timestamp of where you can skip forward to get back to the non-spoiler kind of summary at the end. With that, the other really big thing I wanted to talk about is that this book introduces time travel as a possibility. That was something I was most certainly not expecting to be introduced. And the way it's done is it's something that actually makes a lot of sense with the context of the book, but also really is interesting because not only now are we dealing with being able to see the future and having foretellings among the other powers that are available, but we're actually talking about the fact that time travel is, albeit in a very limited way, possible as well. So you have two things that can make a narrative really hard to work around and to have it still be interesting. And they do set really specific and pretty firm rules with the time travel, even though it's one of the characters actually just kind of guessing and educated guesses, granted, but kind of just guessing and trying to figure out how it actually all works. But we see it very briefly used, and it's done in a way that you don't think it's going to be like a huge, huge impact because it can only be used in a limited way. But I was very impressed that Islington managed to fit both of those concepts into a story and not have it just come off as too much and have it actually really work. There's a ton, like I said, going on here. And the other piece that I really enjoyed is you just don't ever know who's who and what their goals are. So I'm not going to get into any huge specifics, but we see many characters who, once again, are not who they seem to be, or at least are hiding quite a lot. The book kind of is started off. We have Ilsa Anvar, who sends Davian out with a box, and he's supposed to find something or someone. That ended up being something he was specifically told to do. And granted, we find out who told him to do it, but the person that he ends up finding is the really big person who is not quite who you thought they were going to be as well. But we see there's him, and then even the people who help them. We had Terasar, who is helping them, but also is hiding quite a lot. There's another character interrelated with him who's apparently hiding who he is. We see there are different groups of elders who seem to know more than they're letting on. We have shadows that are loosely organized and have a leader who also seems to know quite a lot. And we are introduced to the idea of several different groups on the other side that have so much more power, so much more knowledge, and there is a lot of currents. And characters several times throughout are told that this is actually the way it is, and Mr. Meal says, no, it's not that way. And it really does a lot to make you not quite sure, but it's done in a really nice way. You feel like you get a lot of answers while also still having a lot of questions. And I really, really hope that Islington keeps up the good work and keeps it clean enough, because this is the kind of story that can be very hard to end. It's really something that it can be difficult when you have so many different plot lines, so many different sides, so much going on. Pulling that all together can be difficult, and I really hope that he does come through. But it was a heck of a first book, and it's disrupted my reading schedule even further now, because at this point I'm going to read the other two books before reading something else, because I couldn't put the first book down and I really want to find out how this ends. So you will be seeing the next videos for the next two books in the next couple of weeks as well. So still definitely more to come. But overall, like I said, I was really, really impressed with some of the concepts that are put in here. It's difficult to write with. You know, some of these really big things often can ruin things. And we see that a lot in some other mediums too, even as well. TV shows, movies, relying on different things like this. And it can ruin it, but it didn't do it here. It, like I said, really was an interesting concept. You get to learn more about it, and you know things are definitely going to be coming up. But it's written in such a way that it doesn't seem to detract from what's going on, from the stakes at all. And there are so many things you find out in interesting ways. It does rely a bit on flashbacks as well as flash forwards, which was interesting. And some of the characters you learn more about through the flashbacks, which did remind me a bit of Stormlight Archive as well, where that's a really big device. So overall, it really is a lot of inspiration from Wheel of Time, taking some things from Brandon Sanderson as well. So it really meshes it into a hybrid of a lot of kind of classic fantasy elements with a really modern twist. And it was really, really well done. In general, those are my thoughts. Like I said, I wanted to keep this for the most part pretty spoiler free, even in that brief spoiler section. And it's really something where I had this much to talk about. I've been talking for 18 minutes now without really even getting into spoilers because of the scope of this story. I most certainly would recommend this book to anyone who is a fan of the Wheel of Time and wants to see some of those pieces used in a different way. It was almost like getting an alternate world Wheel of Time type book. Not really, like I said, for the actual writing style, but just so many of the concepts were familiar, but used in a very different way. It started with that inspiration and then went completely different directions often, and really made sure that it doesn't seem to be a copy at all. There's a lot of originality here, but you definitely see the inspirations, and I think that really was intentional by James Islington. There's a ton here as well, and if you like the faster paced type fantasy, more so Brandon Sanderson tends to be a bit more fast paced in comparison, and Robert Jordan certainly. This is really here as well. This story is one that has some darker themes, it has some violence, but it's not at all the basis. So that's the thing I will know. I know a lot of people really, really enjoy grimdark. This is most certainly not grimdark. There are very specific times throughout where the author tries to kind of make you see that even though there's a lot going on, keeps it positive, has characters kind of take a break. That happens a couple of times where it starts to be almost repetitive with a couple of characters just stopping. And, oh, it's so nice to stop and have a conversation. But it's done to kind of keep things a little bit lighter, even though there's a lot going on as well. So this does read, I'd say, almost a little bit more for the overall themes, like kind of classic fantasy, where we're not trying to make it super dark or super light. It just is what it is. If you like big epic fantasy with a lot going on, this is definitely something for you, and I really can't recommend it highly enough. Like I said, I enjoyed the first book so much that I'm immediately going to be starting on the next two, and I have in fact already started the second book at this point as of recording this video. If you did like this video, please feel free to give it a like, and if you want to see more content, both the comparing this to Wheel of Time video coming really soon, and then the reviews for the next two books, definitely feel free to subscribe.